Picture this. You're watching your favorite team play one of their biggest rivalries. It's fast-paced, hits are flying, it's end-to-end action, the goalies are making saves, teams are trading goals, and it heads to overtime. You try to calm yourself down and get your heartbeat back to normal, but the action of the 5-minute overtime starts. 3-on-3. As exciting as regular season hockey can get. Teams trade odd man rushes, breakaways even, but the goaltenders can't be beaten. The clocks wind down, and the game's going to a shootout. A skills competition to decide what team deserves to win after what was just the best 65 minutes of hockey you've ever seen. Your team loses, and you go to bed sad. My opinion about the shootout has changed many times over the years. I've flip-flopped between sides, but I think I've finally come to my consensus, and that is that shootouts are dumb.
In the shootout of any capital, Kuznetsov taking his time, deliberately forward, scores!
Alright, now don't get me wrong, they're super entertaining. It's the rawest form of hockey, shooter versus goalie, one-on-one, who's gonna beat who. But is it exactly the way you want to end a 65-minute hard-fought game? I don't think so. And I mean, if you break it down to the bare bones, it really is just a skills competition. And I think it's really cool to see individual players' pure skill, but in a game that I and many others consider the most team-dependent sport, where you need the most team chemistry to win, to have a game boil down to one player's individual success just doesn't feel right. Now, before you come at me and call me an old head, I think the shootout should still be in the game, but the chances that it happens should be diminished by a lot. If you take a look at this graph, this shows the amount of games going to overtime versus shootouts in a given season. The red line displays the trend of shootouts every year, and the blue line is overtime. And there's some noticeable points to look at. For one, the shootout was introduced in the NHL in the 2005-2006 season. This was because they wanted to cut out ties in hockey that would occur if the 4-on-4 overtime led to nothing. And sure, this fixed the problem of ties, but more games would be ending in a shootout than in overtime. As you can see right here, it reached an all-time worst in 2009-2010, where there were 67 more games decided in a shootout than in overtime. And throughout this period, it averaged around 50 more games ending in a shootout than in overtime, and the NHL wanted to change this. Sure, it's something new that they added to the game, but they didn't want it to overtake the league. And this change came in the 2015-2016 season, where they switched the 5-minute 4-on-4 overtime to a 5-minute 3-on-3 overtime. This drastically helped the league. As you can see, the occurrence of shootouts shot down and continues to go down every year. Obviously, from 2020 to 2021, it was COVID, so the numbers are a bit skewed. But with normal seasons, the NHL has seen extra time games ending in overtime 60 to 64% of the time, which is a lot better than what it was in the early 2000s to mid-2010s, which saw the rate of about 35 to 45% of games ending in overtime. Sure, this trend is good. Less and less games are going to a shootout, and more are ending in overtime, which is exactly what the NHL wanted. But I think just one more change would bring perfect results. In my opinion, shootouts should be the last possible option. It should feel as though the game was going absolutely nowhere in overtime, and the shootout would be the only way to end the game, and I think 5 minutes is just not enough time to determine that. Back at the start of the 2014-2015 season, the AHL changed its overtime format drastically. They went from a 4-on-4 5-minute overtime period just like the NHL, to a 7-minute period that would start 4-on-4, then switch to 3-on-3 with the first whistle after the 4-minute mark. This was largely in part to an experiment ran by the NHL to see how 3-on-3 would work. But there was also a change that the AHL wanted to see, with the president saying what everyone feels, that no one wants games to end in a shootout. This rule change did wonders, causing 75% of extra time games to end in overtime rather than the shootout, a huge decrease in shootouts compared to the previous season, which saw just 35% of extra time games decided in overtime. The next season, along with the NHL, they switched to the 3-on-3 5-minute overtime period that we know today. I would have loved to see the AHL try just one more year of experiments and do a full 7 minutes of 3-on-3, as I bet even more games would end in overtime rather than a shootout. The ECHL also recently adopted a rule change for overtime, which is exactly that, 7 minutes 3-on-3. And this past season, they saw 46 shootouts played out of 190 extra time games. This meant that 77% of extra time games ended in the overtime period as opposed to the shootout, which is probably the number that the NHL should be shooting for, or maybe even higher. I mean, this would definitely improve the scoring in overtime in the NHL, but the change doesn't even have to necessarily be with the length of the period. It could be something with the possession rules that the KHL is testing out in their junior league this upcoming season. Pretty much, players aren't allowed to skate with the puck back to their half of the ice in overtime, and if they do, there would be a face-off in the offending team's end on the first violation, then a penalty on each violation after that. This is going into effect in the MHL, which is Russian Juniors, this upcoming season, so we have no idea how it's going to affect gameplay, but if I did take a guess, I'd assume it increases offense and reduces shootouts. Now, with this possession rule, teams can't really regroup like what the trend has become in the NHL. In NHL 3-on-3, a lot of teams enter the zone, circle back, get a line change in, and sometimes even play the puck back to their goalie to get a full change, and it just drags on and turns one of the most exciting things in hockey into one of the most boring things to watch. I don't think that there's one thing in regular season hockey that's more exciting than a good back and forth overtime game, and once a team starts to regroup and exit the zone, it becomes stale and just boring. Forcing them to keep possession past the center ice line will not only force them to create offense, but it'll also create more odd man rushes the other way. The main reason teams do the regroup thing is that when you shoot in overtime, it's pretty much a turnover unless you get the rebound. But a shot that misses the net can turn into an odd man rush the other way in an instant. So with teams forced to sustain offensive pressure, I'm sure that there will be more odd man rushes, ultimately leading to more goals. The NHL has actually thrown around some ideas like this, and actually at the general managers meeting at the end of the season, the topic came up. For one, they mentioned that there was too much regrouping and not enough attacking, exactly what we just talked about. GM Jim Nill of the Stars voiced his concern with the potential possession style of rule change, and he pretty much said what happens when the puck is poked past the red line or something like that. Would there be a video review? What's the ruling? And he does have a point. Like he said, it opens up a whole new can of worms for the NHL to figure out. Nill also commented on the idea of a shot clock, and he wasn't a fan of that either. So I think if the NHL were to adopt any of these rules, I feel that a 7 or 10 minute overtime could push that 60 to 64% to a high 70% like the ECHL has. Not only are shootouts a bad way to end such a good game, but it really just doesn't show who the better team is. Now, sure, you can make the argument that if a game goes to a shootout, either team deserves to win, right? It's a close game and it goes to a shootout, so obviously it was tight. But sometimes, I will admit it is on rare occasions, but sometimes one team just outplays the other so bad, but they just get unlucky and can't beat the goalie. Now the game goes to a shootout and the other team's goalie stays hot, and then you lose the game after outshooting your opponent by like 20. The best team in the shootout last season was the Ottawa Senators, and miraculously they went 5-0. Obviously, the Sens weren't a very good team. They missed the playoffs and had a below 500 record. The Red Wings went 4-2 in the shootout, and while they were close to the playoffs, they weren't in. And this is because shootouts are mostly a coin flip. Sure, the better team will probably have better players who have a better shooting percentage, but the good shootout takers still only have a 40 or 50% rate, with the elite shooters having about a 60% rate. So most of the time, yes, the better team will win the game even if it goes to a shootout, but I'm sure the better team will win almost every single game if it were to end in overtime. There's probably some rules you can change in the shootout, like adding a shot clock to make it feel more realistic instead of players coming down and doing this.
Of any capital. Kuznetsov taking his time. Deliberately forward. Score!
So you guys can call me old-fashioned all you want, but I think shootouts should be as limited as possible. Sure, it's fun to see every once in a while, and they've given us some of the most iconic moments in recent NHL history.
This is as cheeky as a gal cheeky.
Scored this year. In on Kolzig. Fake between the legs. Oh, Malik went between his legs.
But you start to realize that they're really just a quick way to end the game instead of the right way to end the game. With 3-on-3 being a massive success in terms of decreasing the shootout, I feel like increasing the OT to 10 minutes would be the perfect change and lead to the perfect mix between games ending in an overtime versus a shootout. Now, I know this is a pretty split vote, but let me know what you guys think. Are shootouts a good part of the game, or should they be cut out as much as possible?